everyone. I'm Kelly, and I am a solution consultant with Echolocity. And today I want to talk about approval workflows in Smartsheet. So up on my screen here, you can see I have a classic project intake sheet. So the example we're going to go through today is a 2-level approval process for new project ideas. Now, these approval workflow kind of best practices that we use can be used for any approval workflow. We've worked with many clients for different types of approval workflows. Project intake is definitely one of the most common, but budget expenses would be another type as well. And even though I'm only doing a 2-level, again, these principles can be applied for multi-level. It can be applied for multi-level with different criteria. So I wanted to keep it simple for this example, but just know that it can grow to whatever solution you're trying to build. So I already have some pre-built workflow automations to support this solution. And so just a little bit of background, this is a project intake sheet, right? It has a list of projects, has kind of like standard project charter, project data information. And there's going to be 2 levels of approval. There's an initial reviewer and an approver. And so I'm going to jump right into the workflow automations and walk you through what I've built. One small but really useful tip that I use is when I'm building a workflow, like an approval workflow, I number them, and that helps them to stay in order while I can still use descriptions that logically make sense for a user to read and understand them, and just makes sense, obviously, for troubleshooting. So you can see kind of where in the succession of steps that you're at for troubleshooting if there's an issue. And there's 3 different components to an approval workflow in automation. So there's like the assignment component, there's the alerting component, and then there's kind of the changing data in the sheet to reflect the responses of the different approvers. So the first one I'll cover is assignments. So I actually have a separate kind of assignment workflow. I tagged it with admin at the beginning. I just have the initial reviewer set up right now, so I'll have to add one for the approver. But I would tag them both with admin at the beginning. Another way to like kind of keep automations together, because they do automatically sort alphabetically. They have different options for sorting, but it's really just alphabetically, or like the date it was modified, created, or last run. So from a logical standpoint, the naming makes sense, but then you just want to like tag it at the beginning so that it can sort for you to find them easily. Just want to call out for the assignment, you could use a reference sheet and formulas to fill in the initial reviewer and the approver as well. Like, let's say the initial reviewer is different based on the product or the department or something along those lines. You can pull it in with a formula. The only thing to keep in mind with that one is if the user changes, the department lead or the initial reviewer or whatever changes, it will change for all requests, even previous ones, when you're using a formula. So that's why I use the automation, because you can update it just as easily as a reference sheet, and then you'll still have the historical information of who was the person that reviewed it at the time. And so it's a pretty simple workflow. When rows are added, and then the condition is based on the product, and I have assigned specific people as the initial reviewer. So that's all set up. And so let's jump into our workflow automation for the process of the approvals. So this will include both the alerts component and the updating data, which is called like the change a cell automation in Smartsheet. And as I jump into here, I just want to call out that Smartsheet does actually have an action block. So this is called the action block in their workflow automations for approvals specifically. So you can do a request approval. And you can go to advanced options and you can select, okay, what's the status when the request is submitted? What do you want it to be called when it's approved versus when it's declined? And it's a cool, user experience for when they get the email, and then they can just like click approve or decline. But I would just say that we use a different process for this because we have a lot of use cases where we have more than just those 3 responses from the initial reviewer and or approver. So a really common use case, for example, is needs more information. So typically a requester is submitting a project idea The initial reviewer is reviewing it, and maybe there's not enough information for that initial reviewer to approve or reject. So they update it as needs more information, and then it sends back to the requester. So this approval workflow process doesn't account for that. So I think in certain use cases, it could be really handy, but it's just not a common one that I use. So instead, I use the change a cell automation and then, or action block, and then the alerts. So again here, when a row is added, an ID is any value, change the cell value in the initial reviewer status to ready to review, right? So that's the first step. That's kind of that submitted status that you saw in the approval workflow. And then the next step is a automation specifically for an alert to the initial reviewer. Now, I could have put that alert in that first notification or that first automation, because you can double stack certain action blocks, not all of them. You can double stack alerts with other ones, but the initial reviewer being notified on ready to review is going to be two use cases: when a request is initially submitted and when the approver sends it back for more information. So you'll see how this kind of plays out as I go through the workflows, but essentially I wanted a separate one so I could account for both of these situations. So when the initial review status changes to ready to review, and the approval status, it needs more info, that means it came back from the approver. So I want the message to reflect that it needs more information. Otherwise, it's just going to be, the situation would be it's a new project idea and it's ready for review. Okay. The next step in the workflow automation is, let's say, for example, the initial review status changes to needs more info. Then we're going to send an update request to the requester. Oftentimes, the requester does not have access to the intake sheet, so we're going to use an update request. Now, there may be different use cases. You could send an alert and just have them update it in the sheet if that makes sense for your use case. You may have access to advanced tools and use dynamic view, in which case you can put a link to the dynamic view in there. But the most common is that we send an update request with the specific fields that they would need to update in order to send back to the initial reviewer. I actually don't have that workflow built out right now, but essentially I would add an additional status for the requester to be able to update it to say like resubmitted or something like that. And then that would trigger the initial reviewer status to change back to ready to review and then notify them, right? The next step I have is really that approval or rejection. So I have one each. I did like a 3A, 3B for approved versus rejected. A rejected is, it's just really notifying the requester that the request has been rejected, and it's updating the project status to be canceled. In the approved option, it is notifying the approver, and it's changing that approval status for ready for approval. So in this case, I did put the alert stacked in automation. I don't need a separate one for the approver in this case, but really you could go either way. Sometimes we do recommend keeping automations as simple as possible versus really complex, because it's easier to troubleshoot, honestly, if you have more simple automations than less really complex automations that you have to, follow complex condition paths. But anyway, that being said, this is simple enough, so we did just stack them in this use case. And then we have the approver needs more information. So it's a similar thing, right? When the approver needs more information, the initial reviewer status changes to ready to review, and then that alert will trigger from that previous automation that I shared. And then we have, the approved and rejected, which is essentially going to notify the requester whether it's rejected or approved and change those cells, right? So for example, if it's been approved, we're also going to change the project phase to discovery. It defaults to idea when the form is submitted. So we're going to change it to discovery because once the project is approved, we're moving that project into discovery. Awesome. So those are the workflow automations that I've built out for this multi-level approval workflow. Again, this can become a lot more robust and as complex as you really need. We've built up to up to 7 different approval workflow tiers. And then again, even some more complex ones where it has some more complex conditions, let's say. So if the project is a Smartsheet project, it's going to, follow a different path than if it is a different work management tool project, in this use case example for this intake sheet. So I can just show a quick example. So I'm going to go to the project intake form. Oops, I'm going to go back here and open up my form. I meant to have this as a contact field. Typically I would have that as a contact field. So a workflow automation test. And we're going to do Smartsheet and description. I'm not going to put a lot of details in here, just the bare bones. Defaults to idea. Let's submit that. And we will go back to our intake sheet. Okay, so we pop back in here. You can see the new project added. And if I scroll over to the right, you can see it was assigned to me as the initial reviewer and then marked as ready for review. I'm just going to show you if I mark it as approved. I'm going to save that. We're going to give Smartsheet a minute to update itself. Typically, you don't need to refresh to get the status to show, but sometimes in demos, we do that just to speed along the process. Right? And then you can see the approval status changed to ready for approval. I don't have that approver assignment workflow in place, so typically I would have that in there, and there would be approver here. And then again, that person's going to be notified based on this change to ready for approval. If I change this to needs more info and save it, then we'll see here, we can refresh. And then you'll see this gets marked back as ready for review. And I already heard my email come through for that notification that came through that it is ready for review. So I hope you all found this helpful. Please don't hesitate to leave a comment on this video if you have any questions or specific use cases. We're happy to always answer questions in the comments, or feel free to book a free discovery call with us if you need any support in this area. Also, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and get notified on any new Smartsheet videos that we post for best practices and tips and tricks. Thanks for listening.